Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, you can support us by writing a review on the Apple Podcasts app or sharing your favorite episode as an Instagram or Facebook story. And of course, you can share us with a friend. If you would like to get an email once a week with upcoming sleep stories and other news, subscribe to this newsletter at snoozecast.com. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Sunbeams. Tonight, we'll read a short story called The Golden Touch from A Wonder Book and Tanglewood Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne, published in 1910. This episode is dedicated to our patron, Kathryn, who is craving something from Greek mythology, and our listener, Sue, who suggested this particular book. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Once upon a time, there lived a very rich man and a king besides, whose name was Midas, and he had a little daughter named Marigold. This King Midas was fonder of gold than of anything else in the world. He valued his royal crown chiefly because it was composed of that precious metal. If he loved anything better, or half so well, it was the one little maiden who played so merrily around her father's footstool. But the more Midas loved his daughter, the more did he desire and seek for wealth. He thought, foolish man, that the best thing he could possibly do for this dear child would be to bequeath her the largest pile of yellow, glistening coin that had ever been heaped together since the world was made. And yet, in his earlier days, before he was so entirely possessed of this insane desire for riches, King Midas had shown a great taste for flowers. He had planted a garden in which grew the biggest and most beautiful and sweetest roses that any mortal ever saw or smelt. These roses were still growing in the garden, as large, as lovely, and as fragrant as when Midas used to pass whole hours in gazing at them and inhaling their perfume. At length, as people always grow more and more foolish, unless they take care to grow wiser and wiser, Midas had got to be so exceedingly unreasonable that he could scarcely bear to see or touch any object that was not gold. He made it his custom, therefore, to pass a large portion of every day in a dark and dreary apartment, underground, at the basement of his palace. It was here that he kept his wealth. From the dungeon-like window fell a sunbeam that he valued for no other reason but that his treasure would not shine without its help. And then would he reckon over the coins in the bag, toss up the bar, and catch it as it came down. Sift through the gold dust through his fingers, look at the funny image of his own face as reflected in the burnished circumference of the cup, and whisper to himself, "O Midas, rich King Midas, what a happy man art thou." But it was laughable to see how the image of his face kept grinning at him out of the polished surface of the cup. It seemed to be aware of his foolish behavior and to have a naughty inclination to make fun of him. Midas called himself a happy man, but felt that he was not yet quite so happy as he might be. The very tip-top of enjoyment would never be reached unless the whole world were to become his treasure room and be filled with the yellow metal which should be all his own. Midas was enjoying himself in his treasure room one day, as usual, when he perceived a shadow fall over the heaps of gold, and, looking up suddenly, what should he behold but the figure of a stranger standing in the bright and narrow sunbeam. It was a young man with a cheerful and ruddy face. Whether it was the imagination of King Midas threw a yellow tinge over everything, or whatever the cause might be, he could not help fancying that the smile with which the stranger regarded him had a kind of golden radiance in it. Certainly, although his figure intercepted the sunshine, there was now a brighter gleam upon all the piled-up treasures than before. As Midas knew that he had carefully turned the key in the lock, and that no mortal strength could possibly break into his treasure room, he of course concluded that his visitor must be something more than mortal. It is no matter about telling you who he was. The stranger gazed about the room, and when his lustrous smile had glistened upon all the golden objects that were there, he turned again to Midas. "You are a wealthy man, friend Midas," he observed. "I doubt whether any other four walls on earth contain so much gold as you have contrived to pile up in this room." "I have done pretty well," answered Midas, in a discontented tone. "But, after all, it is but a trifle when you consider that it has taken me my whole life to get it together. If one could live 1,000 years, he might have time to grow rich." "What?" exclaimed the stranger. "Then you are not satisfied?" Midas shook his head. "And pray, what would satisfy you?" asked the stranger. "Merely for the curiosity of the thing. I should be glad to know." Midas paused and meditated. He felt at present with this stranger, who had such a golden luster in his good-humored smile, had come hither with both the power and the purpose of gratifying his utmost wishes. Now, therefore, was the fortunate moment when he had but to speak and obtain whatever possible or seemingly impossible thing it might come into his head to ask. Raising his head, he looked the lustrous stranger in the face. "Well, Midas," observed his visitor, "I see that you have at length hit upon something that will satisfy you. Tell me your wish." "It is only this," replied Midas. "I am weary of collecting my treasures with so much trouble, and beholding the heap so diminutive. After I have done my best, I wish everything that I touch to be changed to gold." The stranger's smile grew so very broad that it seemed to fill the room like an outburst of the sun, gleaming into a shadowy dell where the yellow autumnal leaves, for so looked the lumps and particles of gold, lie strewn in the glow of light. "The golden touch!" exclaimed he. "You certainly deserve credit, friend Midas, for striking out so brilliant a conception. But are you quite sure that this will satisfy you?" "How could it fail?" said Midas. "And will you never regret the possession of it?" "What could induce me?" asked Midas. "I ask nothing else to render me perfectly happy." "Be it as you wish, then," replied the stranger, waving his hand in token of farewell. "Tomorrow, at sunrise, you will find yourself gifted with the golden touch." The figure of the stranger then became exceedingly bright, and Midas involuntarily closed his eyes. On opening them again, he beheld only one yellow sunbeam in the room, and all around him the glistening of the precious metal which he had spent his life in hoarding up. Day had hardly peeped over the hills when King Midas was broad awake, and, stretching his arms out of bed, began to touch the objects that were within reach. He was anxious to prove whether the golden touch had really come according to the stranger's promise. So he laid his finger on a chair by the bedside and on various other things, but was grievously disappointed to perceive that they remained of exactly the same substance as before. Indeed, he felt very much afraid that he had only dreamed about the lustrous stranger, or else that the latter had been making game of him. And what a miserable affair would it be if, after all his hopes, Midas must content himself with what little gold he could scrape together by ordinary means, instead of creating it by touch. All this while, it was only the gray of the morning, with but a streak of brightness along the edge of the sky where Midas could not see it. He lay in a very sad mood, regretting the downfall of his hopes, and kept growing sadder and sadder until the earliest sunbeam shone through the window and gilded the ceiling over his head. It seemed to Midas that this bright yellow sunbeam was reflected in rather a singular way on the white covering of the bed. Looking more closely, what was his astonishment and delight when he found that this linen fabric had been transmuted to what seemed a woven texture of the purest and brightest gold. The golden touch had come to him with the first sunbeam. Midas started up in a kind of joyful frenzy and ran about the room, grasping at everything that happened to be in his way. He seized one of the bedposts, and it became immediately a fluted golden pillar. He drew out his handkerchief, which little Marigold had hemmed for him. That was likewise gold, with the dear child's neat and pretty stitches running all along the border in gold thread. Somehow or other, this last transformation did not quite please King Midas. He would rather that his little daughter's handiwork should have remained just the same as when she climbed his knee and put it into his hand. But it was not worth while to vex himself about a trifle. Midas now took his spectacles from his pocket and put them on his nose in order that he might see more distinctly what he was about. In those days, spectacles for common people had not been invented, but were already worn by kings. Else, how could Midas have had any? To his great perplexity, however, excellent as the glasses were, he discovered that he could not possibly see through them. But this was the most natural thing in the world, for on taking them off, the transparent crystals turned out to be plates of yellow metal, and of course were worthless as spectacles, though valuable as gold. It struck Midas as rather inconvenient that, with all his wealth, he could never again be rich enough to own a pair of serviceable spectacles. "It is no great matter, nevertheless," said he to himself very philosophically. "We cannot expect any great good without its being accompanied with some small inconvenience. The golden touch is worth the sacrifice of a pair of spectacles, at least, if not of one's very eyesight. My own eyes will serve for ordinary purposes, and little Marigold will soon be old enough to read to me." Wise King Midas was so exalted by his good fortune that the palace seemed not sufficiently spacious to contain him. He lifted the door latch. It was brass only a moment ago, but golden when his fingers quitted it, and emerged into the garden. Here, as it happened, he found a great number of beautiful roses in full bloom, and others in all the stages of lovely bud and blossom. Very delicious was their fragrance in the morning breeze. Their delicate blush was one of the fairest sights in the world. So gentle, so modest, and so full of sweet tranquility did these roses seem to be. But Midas knew a way to make them far more precious, according to his way of thinking, than roses had ever been before. So he took great pains in going from bush to bush and exercised his magic touch until every individual flower and bud, and even the worms at the heart of some of them, were changed to gold. By the time this good work was completed, King Midas was summoned to breakfast, and as the morning air had given him an excellent appetite, he made haste back to the palace. Little Marigold had not yet made her appearance. Her father ordered her to be called, and seating himself at table, awaited the child's coming in order to begin his own breakfast. To do Midas justice, he really loved his daughter and loved her so much the more this morning, on account of the good fortune which had befallen him. It was not a great while before he heard her coming along the passageway, crying bitterly. Marigold slowly opened the door and showed herself with her apron at her eyes, still sobbing as if her heart would break. "Hey, my little lady," cried Midas. "Pray, what is the matter with you this bright morning?" Marigold, without taking the apron from her eyes, held out her hand, in which was one of the roses which Midas had so recently transmuted. "Beautiful!" exclaimed her father. "And what is there in this magnificent golden rose to make you cry?" "Oh, dear father," answered the child, as well as her sobs would let her, "it is not beautiful, but the ugliest flower that ever grew. As soon as I was dressed, I ran into the garden to gather some roses for you, because I know you like them, and like them the better when gathered by me. But, oh dear, dear me, what do you think has happened? Such a misfortune. All the beautiful roses that smelled so sweetly and had so many lovely blushes are blighted and spoilt. They are grown quite yellow, as you see this one, and have no longer any fragrance. What can have been the matter with them?" "Oh, my dear little girl, pray don't cry about it," said Midas, who was ashamed to confess that he himself had wrought the charge which so greatly afflicted her. "Sit down and eat your bread and milk. You will find it easy enough to exchange a golden rose like that one, which will last hundreds of years, for an ordinary one, which would wither in a day." "I don't care for roses such as this," cried Marigold, tossing it away. "It has no smell, and the hard petals prick my nose." Midas, meanwhile, had poured out a cup of coffee, and as a matter of course, the coffee pot, whatever metal it may have been when he took it up, was gold when he set it down. He thought to himself that it was rather an extravagant style of splendor in a king of his simple habits to breakfast off a service of gold, and began to be puzzled with the difficulty of keeping his treasures safe. Amid these thoughts, he lifted a spoonful of coffee to his lips, and sipping it, was astonished to perceive that the instant his lips touched the liquid, it became molten gold, and the next moment hardened into a lump. "Ah!" exclaimed Midas, rather aghast. What is the matter, father? Asked little Marigold, gazing at him, with the tears still standing in her eyes. Nothing, child, nothing, said Midas. Eat your milk before it gets cold. He took one of the smoking hot pancakes and had scarcely broken it when, to his mortification, though a moment before it had been of the whitest wheat, it assumed the yellow hue of Indian meal. Almost in despair, he helped himself to a boiled egg, which immediately underwent a change similar to those of the cake. Well, this is a quandary, thought he, leaning back in his chair and looking quite enviously at little Marigold, who was now eating her bread and milk with great satisfaction, hoping that, by dint of great dispatch, he might avoid what he now felt to be a considerable inconvenience. King Midas next snatched a hot potato and attempted to cram it into his mouth and swallow it in a hurry. But the Golden Touch was too nimble for him. He found his mouth full, not of mealy potato, but of solid metal. Father, dear father, cried little Marigold, who was a very affectionate child. Pray, what is the matter? Have you burnt your mouth? Ah, dear child, groaned Midas dolefully. I don't know what is to become of your father. These reflections so troubled wise King Midas that he began to doubt whether, after all, riches are the one desirable thing in the world, or even the most desirable. But this was only a passing thought. So fascinated was Midas with the glitter of the yellow metal that he would still have refused to give up the Golden Touch for so paltry a consideration as breakfast. Just imagine what a price for one meal's victuals. It would be quite too dear, thought Midas. Nevertheless, so great was his hunger and the perplexity of his situation that he again groaned aloud, and very grievously too. Our pretty Marigold could endure it no longer. She sat a moment gazing at her father and trying with all the might of her little wits to find out what was the matter with him. Then, with a sweet and sorrowful impulse to comfort him, she started from her chair and, running to Midas, threw her arms affectionately about his knees. He bent down and kissed her. He felt that his little daughter's love was worth 1,000 times more than he had gained by the Golden Touch. My precious, precious Marigold, cried he. But Marigold made no answer. Alas, what had he done? How fatal was the gift which the stranger bestowed. The moment the lips of Midas touched Marigold's forehead, a change had taken place. Her sweet rosy face, so full of affection as it had been, assumed a glittering yellow color, with yellow teardrops congealing on her cheeks. Her beautiful brown ringlets took the same tint. Her soft and tender little form grew hard and inflexible within her father's encircling arms. Little Marigold was a human child no longer, but a golden statue. Yes, there she was, with the questioning look of love, grief, and pity hardened into her face. It was the prettiest and most woeful sight that ever mortal saw. All the features and tokens of Marigold were there, and even the beloved little dimple remained in her golden chin. But the more perfect was the resemblance, the greater was the father's agony at beholding this golden image, which was all that was left him of a daughter. It had been a favorite phrase of Midas, whenever he felt particularly fond of the child, to say that she was worth her weight in gold. And now the phrase had become literally true. While he was in this tumult of despair, he suddenly beheld the smiling stranger standing near the door. Midas bent down his head without speaking, for he recognized the same figure which had appeared to him the day before in the treasure room, and had bestowed on him this disastrous faculty of the golden touch. "Well, friend Midas," said the stranger, "pray, how do you succeed with the golden touch?" Midas shook his head. "I am very miserable," said he. "Very miserable indeed," exclaimed the stranger. "And how happens that? Have I not faithfully kept my promise with you? Have you not everything that your heart desired?" "Gold is not everything," answered Midas, "and I have lost all that my heart really cared for." "Ah, so you have made a discovery since yesterday," observed the stranger. "Let us see then. Which of these two things do you think is really worth the most? The gift of the golden touch, or 1 cup of clear cold water?" "Oh, blessed water," exclaimed Midas. "It will never moisten my parched throat again." "The golden touch," continued the stranger, "or a crust of bread?" "A piece of bread," answered Midas. "A piece of bread is worth all the gold on earth." "The golden touch?" asked the stranger. "Or your own little Marigold, warm, soft, and loving as she was an hour ago?" "Oh, my child, my dear child," cried poor Midas, wringing his hands. "I would not have given that one small dimple in her chin for the power of changing this whole big earth into a solid lump of gold." "You are wiser than you were, King Midas," said the stranger, looking seriously at him. "Your own heart, I perceive, has not been entirely changed from flesh to gold. Tell me, now, do you sincerely desire to rid yourself of this golden touch?" "It is hateful to me," replied Midas. "Go then," said the stranger, "and plunge into the river that glides past the bottom of your garden. Take likewise a vase of this same water and sprinkle it over any object that you may desire to change back again from gold into its former substance. If you do this in earnestness and sincerity, it may possibly repair the mischief which your avarice has occasioned." King Midas bowed low, and when he lifted his head, the lustrous stranger had vanished. You will easily believe that Midas lost no time in snatching up a great earthen pitcher, but alas me, it was no longer earthen after he touched it, and hastening to the riverside, as he scampered along and forced his way through the shrubbery, it was positively marvelous to see how the foliage turned yellow behind him, as if the autumn had been there and nowhere else. On reaching the river's brink, he plunged headlong in, without waiting so much as to pull off his shoes. "Poof, poof, poof," snorted King Midas, as his head emerged out of the water. "Well, this is really a refreshing bath, and I think it must have quite washed away the golden touch. And now for filling my pitcher." As he dipped the pitcher into the water, it gladdened his very heart to see it change from gold into the same good, honest earthen vessel which it had been before he touched it. He was conscious also of a change within himself. A cold, hard, and heavy weight seemed to have gone out of his bosom. No doubt, his heart had been gradually losing its human substance and transmuting itself into metal, but had now softened back again into flesh. Perceiving a violet that grew on the bank of the river, Midas touched it with his finger and was overjoyed to find that the delicate flower retained its purple hue instead of undergoing a yellow blight. King Midas hastened back to the palace, and, I suppose, the servants knew not what to make of it when they saw him so carefully bringing home an earthen pitcher of water. But that water, which was to undo all the mischief that his folly had wrought, was more precious to Midas than an ocean of molten gold could have been. The first thing he did, as you need hardly be told, was to sprinkle it by handfuls over the golden figure of little Marigold. No sooner did it fall on her than you would have laughed to see how the rosy color came back to the dear child's cheek, and how she began to sneeze and sputter, and how astonished she was to find herself dripping wet, and her father still throwing more water over her. "Pray do not, dear father," cried she. "See how you have wet my nice frock, which I put on only this morning." For Marigold did not know that she had been a little golden statue, nor could she remember anything that had happened since the moment when she ran with outstretched arms to comfort poor King Midas. Her father did not think it necessary to tell his beloved child how very foolish he had been, but contented himself with showing how much wiser he had now grown. For this purpose, he led little Marigold into the garden, where he sprinkled all the remainder of the water over the rose bushes, and with such good effect that about 5,000 roses recovered.